Well, today we are continuing our series entitled Power Struggle, where we are looking at that struggle that exists, that tension that exists in an election cycle, in an election season. God has something to say to his people about how we should handle election cycles, how we should deal with our human governments. And so we're looking at that. And my challenge to you is categorically and undeniably to reject political power as a means to change America. Stop looking for and trying to get political power, and instead just use the power that you already have because God gave it to you. And so we've been looking at some different things: the power to love, the power to serve, the power to witness. And today I've entitled our message, In God We Trust, and we are going to look at the power that you have to trust. And maybe you could modify that a little bit and say the power that you have to choose who you trust, because that's really where the battle is. Your ultimate trust has to end in Jesus. That's where we have to get to. And if it doesn't end there, we're going to be in trouble. Now, John Dixon, whom I love, he's an Anglican guy, little offshoot of the Catholics there, but he's got an Australian accent, which really helps me like him a lot. But he's got a podcast called Undeceptions, and in that podcast, he recently addressed the issue. I think it was back in August. He addressed the issue of trust. And some of the things that he said are valuable as we start today. The Pew Research Center has been searching and doing some studies on the issue of trust. And obviously, one of the driving forces behind the erosion of trust in America is the American media. And the Pew Research Center has kind of pointed to the media, not blaming them, but just isolating them and identifying them as a leading reason why there is such an overarching lack of trust in American society. Very simply, Americans don't trust each other like they used to. And so for those of us who are followers of Jesus, the charge is very clear. How do we work within our society with the power of God at work in us to become more trustworthy people? Interestingly, The Atlantic magazine recently reported that back in 1972, a study found that 45% of Americans found that American society was generally trustworthy. That was back in 72, and a recent study that they just did followed that up. It's down to 30%, and we know that there's not an upward trajectory in American people trusting each other. And so there's this blanketed problem across our culture where we don't trust each other. And so as Christians, when we say put your trust in God, what's the first thing people are doing? Why? Like if we could visualize what's happening, we do it with the political commercials. I've started using them as laughing points because it just helps the comedic level in my life to watch political commercials now because it's such white noise. But what am I doing every time that I see a political commercial? I know I am. I don't know about you, but I'm like, interesting how you phrased that. Interesting how you spun that. That's just what I do. Why? Because I don't trust my own government. Now, that's me. Maybe you're a little bit different. But according to the Edelman Index, which measures the Edelman Trust Index, which was updated this year in 2024, they did a global study on nations that have the highest level of trust within them. The nation that trusts its government and its people at the highest level is China, 79%. Followed by India, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. Those are the top five. Top five people groups in the world that trust each other and trust their government. Australia came in at 15th. The U.S. came in at 22nd. South Korea came in at 24th. And Britain came in at 27th. Now, if I read between the lines on that with my analytical mind, I say to myself, those of us who brag about our freedom the most are the ones who trust the least. And Os Guinness, who was born in China, the son of missionaries in China, he's an English gentleman in his 80s now, I believe, prolific writer, and he has been observing for decades of his life the American experiment. And his take on America has always been, the greatest enemy of our freedom is freedom itself. And I believe that this Edelman Trust Index demonstrates that to a certain degree. And of course, we'll sit there and we'll say, well, Chinese people are afraid to tell people that they don't trust their government because then they'll kill them. Like, that's just what we do in our brains when we see something like that. But really, you're not surprised that America is at 22nd in the world in terms of the culture of trust. And so, as we use that kind of to set things up today, I want us to look at Jesus and the disciples and some of their interactions with authorities, governmental figures and government authorities, and see what they have to say, because if we're going to put our trust in God, like, and isn't it ironic that on the back of our currency it says, "In God we trust"? And like one of the places that we least seem to trust God is with our money. So I thank the Founding Fathers for that, because that's exactly what I want to exemplify with my life. You see, when I give money, I am believing everything that currency says. In God I trust. He will take care of my needs. I think that's ironic, but if we're going to trust God at the highest level, then we need to know what we can trust about Him. Because many of us, we do that with God, don't we? We cross our arms, we kind of lean away, and we say, well, God, why should I trust you? Why should I trust you with government? Why should I trust you with my work? Why should I trust you with my family? Why should I trust you with my finances? Why should I trust you with my eternity? So we're going to go to John 19, Acts 4, and Romans 13, all in the New Testament. I'll set the stage in these three. First of all, John 19, we're going to see Jesus standing before Pilate. And then we'll see in Acts chapter 4, the disciples, after they had been released from prison, they healed a blind man on the Sabbath day. The guy got up and walked off the steps and stopped begging for church people's money. And for that, the religious leaders and the political leaders of the day threw the disciples in prison. Yeah, whatever. All right. And then they threatened them and they released them. And so the disciples then begin to pray, and we are given insight into their prayer about that whole encounter in Acts chapter 4. And then Romans 13, Paul, writing to the Christians in Rome, talks about government. So let's start in John 19. We'll read verses 8 through 12, and then we'll just make our way through these. John 19, verse 8. When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus said, "You'd have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. So the one who has handed me over to you has the greater sin. Not Judas, but Caiaphas, by the way." Verse 12. Then Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders shouted, "If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." Interesting that the Jews all of a sudden started to sing the praises of Caesar. They hated him, and yet they used him because they knew Pilate was afraid of him. That's what we do with our humanity. Fascinating. Let's go over to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4. And we start here in verse 23. We'll read through verse 31. As soon as they were freed, Peter and John returned to the other believers and told them what the leading priests and elders had said. When they heard the report, all the believers lifted their voice together in prayer to God. "O sovereign Lord, creator of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them, you spoke long ago by the Holy Spirit through your ancestor David, your servant, saying, 'Why were the nations angry? Why did they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepared for battle. The rulers gathered together against the Lord and against his Messiah. In fact, This has happened here in this very city. For Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, the governor, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel were all united against Jesus, your holy servant, whom you anointed. But everything they did was determined beforehand according to your will. That's troubling. But nonetheless, let's go to Romans 13. We'll come back to that. Verse 1. Everyone, Paul said, must submit to governing authorities. Well, that stinks. Did I just say that out loud? Oh, man. Okay, here we go. For all authority comes from God. And those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of the authorities? Do what is right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants, sent for your good. But if you're doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them, not only to avoid punishment, but also to keep a clear conscience. Pay your taxes too, for the same reasons. For government workers need to be paid. They're serving God in what they do. Give to everyone what you owe them. Pay your taxes and government fees to those who collect them, and give respect and honor to those who fear or who are in authority. Boy, could have left Romans 13 out, couldn't have God? Wouldn't that have been nice? That just stinks, like everywhere. Like, really? So let's talk about what we can trust here, and we'll come back to these three texts as we talk about each one of these. What we can trust is, number one, that God has a master plan. God has a master plan when it comes to American government, when it comes to Chinese government, when it comes to Palestinian government, when it comes to Israeli government, when it comes to Russian government, and Bad Vlad on his horse without his shirt on. You know, I mean, one of my favorite guys to look for news. What pictures did they get? Did he wax? God has a master plan. When Jesus responded to Pilate's assertion, what did he remind him of? He said, Pilate, you think you have power, but the only power you have is because God gave it to you. You see, God's got a plan. And Romans 13 reminds us that 100% of all government workers are servants of the Most High God, and they will answer to God for their service, not to us, but to Him. But it is not our job to try to do their job. It's our job to do what? To submit to them. Insofar as they're not asking us to sin, then of course we don't do it, because we submit to God above them. And that is a powerful, powerful understanding. But God is at work, and He has a master plan. What do verses 27 and 28 say in Acts 27? Listen, everybody that was there, Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, the Galileans, and the Jews who were all present at the crucifixion of Jesus, they were there. Why? Because it was part of God's eternal plan that His Son would come to earth and be crucified naked on a cross because of your sin. From eternity, God had that planned. His plan is not a surprise to Him. History, as we like to say, is unfolding in the palm of God's hand. We are surprised by things that happen. God is not surprised by American government. Shocker. God has a master plan, and you can trust His master plan. In fact, what does Romans 8 tell us? God causes all things. He causes your high taxes, the injustices you face in court, if you've ever faced those. You know, the tickets you get, that are just police officers with nothing to do, even though you were doing 45 in a 25. Yeah, you should have been in jail. You look good in orange. You should be streaming us this morning. Why'd they let you go? I don't know, right? I sure hope that wasn't a word from the Lord. But seriously, God has a master plan, and everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you love God, it works together for our good. You can trust it. Secondly, we can trust not only that God has a master plan, but that the results of my obedience are in God's hands. And we struggle with this, and so do you. When you obey God, you expect God to bless you, yes? I mean, if you're a giver, I have been a tither for as long as I can remember. And because I tithe to the Lord and honor Him with the first fruits of the wealth that He gives to me, I expect His financial blessing. You know what happens when God doesn't give me financial blessing? I get pouty. But you see, I have to remember that my job is to obey. The results are not in my hands. They are in God's hands. Do you see Jesus here? I mean, think about John 19. Jesus obeyed at every level, and where did it take Him? It took Him straight to the cross. Are you okay if your obedience to God takes you to your death? That's what trusting God means. That's the ultimate test. And when it comes to a government like ours and an election cycle like the one that we're in, our job is to do what we know to do. This is one of the reasons why I think voting is important, because voting gives me an opportunity to say, okay, I like this initiative and I like what this person stands for. That's good. It would be good for my society. So because I have been given the right to vote, I am going to go vote, even though 20 out of 22 people tell me your vote doesn't make a difference. But you see, I'm not voting for America. I'm actually honoring God by doing my voting. Like that's the perspective that I take. And if I'm just going to ignore the opportunity to try to do good, but what if my people don't get in? What if my initiative doesn't pass? The results are not in my hands, they are in God's hands. And Romans 13 is, I mean, man, if you're a leader in any type of authority, let alone government authority, what a sobering passage of Scripture. You know, the only reason I have authority in this church is not because this church voted me in 28-2 or 27-2. No, it's 29-2. There we go. I got it. I landed. Hey. Yeah, 29-2. I got voted in on a Sunday night, 29-2, in July of 2002. Was it that vote that put me in this position of authority? 100% absolutely not. Romans 13 is very clear that God has put me here. If you're a manager at work, if you're a business owner, God has given that to you, and how it changes your life when you understand that and you walk accordingly. But you see, the results of how things go with the decisions that I make in leadership, or the decisions that our politicians make in leadership, those results are in the hands of God. And we can trust God with the answers. Would you rather trust the people on the ballot, or would you rather trust God? I'd rather trust God. That's where I land. And they are there because of God's authority. Now, think about Jesus. He obeyed at every step. In fact, there are 6 different trials that happened. 100% of them were illegal. Did you know that? Jesus was illegally put to death, according to the laws of the Romans and the Jews. He stood before Annas, the ex-high priest. That was at night illegal. He stood before Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas the high priest. That trial was illegal. He stood before the Sanhedrin, and what they did there was illegal. He stood before Pilate the first time. That was illegal. He went to Herod. That was illegal. He came back to Pilate the pirate. There we go. Should be another Pirates of the Caribbean coming out. Oh, look for Pilate to be the main character. But he comes to Pilate the second time. 6 different times in the course of several hours, Jesus was put through shams of injustice. And what did he do? He kept obeying his Father by submitting to the governing authorities. Does that trouble you? Because it troubles me. But when we're talking about our relationship to government, our job is to obey, and we leave the results in the hands of God. That's how it works. And we can trust not only that God has a master plan, but that God will take care of those results as well. Number 3, we can trust that God's work will always continue. You don't need to be here, and I don't need to be here for God's work to continue. If I die, if you die, God's work will continue. With or without you. Wow. I mean, that hurts me. That hurts me. It just hurts me. But it's true. Evil governments cannot stop the work of God. I've been saying this repeatedly throughout the series. It looked like for those 3 days when Jesus was in the tomb, it looked like the greatest powers on the planet had defeated the powers of God. The disciples were in hiding, fearing for their lives. But then Jesus walked out of that tomb. And he proved that not even the greatest powers on the planet could keep him down. You cannot defeat the purposes of God. I don't know where America fits in biblical prophecy, but I do know where God's people fit in biblical prophecy. And since we don't know where America as a nation fits, let's just focus on the personal responsibility. And that's the responsibility that you have and that I have, to live lives of obedience to God. God's work will always continue. The place where the disciples were gathered in Acts chapter 4, after they had given their prayer of thanks to God, and they had said, you brought all these people together, all these government authorities together to have Jesus crucified. We recognize that that was by your hand. We recognize that. What happened to that place where they were gathering? The place where they were gathering was shaken because God was confirming to them that their obedience to Him had been seen by Him, that He was on their side, that they had the power that they needed to do His work. And you do too. You have the power to trust God with everything in your life. If democracy fails, you can trust God. If America has the third great awakening and millions come to faith in Christ, you can trust God. You can put your trust in Him. This is what we can trust about God. There are none of these things can the government give to you. They can give you their promises. We don't know if they'll keep them. They keep some. They backtrack on what we think are most of them. My goodness. Who are we going to trust? Well, if we'll get our eyes off the political cycle and we'll get our eyes on the business of heaven, we won't be bothered by the political cycle because we'll understand that God's work continues. It continues. It continues, one life at a time, one intersection of relationship at a time. This is what is so powerful about trusting God. He has a master plan. The results of our obedience are in His hand, and His work will always continue. And so what's it look like when you put your trust in God? I'm so glad you asked because I want to give you a modern day example of this. Mark Rutland, Dr. Mark Rutland, who has been, he was a missionary for a couple of decades. He's been rescuing little girls in Southeast Asia for, I think, close to 30 years from sex trafficking. He served as a lead pastor in a church in Florida. He has turned around 2 universities as a leader. He founded the National Institute of Christian Leadership. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's incredible guy. Just tons and tons of stories. He tells the story of his early days as a missionary. He was down in Mexico. And while he was in Mexico, he went to this, out in the bush, the backwater parts of whatever region of Mexico that he was in. The people wanted him to go there. And so he went there, and this place was far and out of the way, and it was not a good place to be. And the people of the church, when they got him to their church, it was just a little church, looked kind of like a chicken coop type of thing that had some boards, or poles that had gaps between them, had a concrete floor, bare benches, all this kind of stuff. But this place had a reputation, this particular city. In fact, there was a pastor who became an evangelist to this particular area and this particular little town. And his name, I'll call him Miguel. And Miguel went to this town. There had, in fact, been the church people were telling Rutland that there had been a murder that had taken place in this town. They told the federal police about it, and the federal police said, "We are not coming to that place. Bury the body and move on." Not even the government wanted to try to tackle the crime there. Miguel, here's what he would do. Every week, he would get on his motorcycle. His wife would be right behind him. He strapped a flatbed to his motorcycle. He had 4 little girls. He would load them on the flatbed like cordwood. He would rope them to it, and he would, there they go. As they would approach the village, the villagers would be throwing rocks at them and all this. He'd unload his family. They'd go into to this village, and they'd begin to preach, and the people were just horrible to him, but then something started to happen. Some of the girls and the mothers began to get saved. And as Rutland says, there's nothing more inconvenient to an unrighteous man than a godly woman. And so these salvations really started to pile up, and it was the females who were getting saved, and they built this church. And finally, one weekend, when Miguel was there, they start having church, and he can hear on the outside. There's a group of I would call them soldiers, but that would be the wrong, because they had no authority there. But they were bullies. They came and they had machetes, and they were sticking their machetes between the slats of that chicken coop style church, and running their machetes up and down like this, hoping that they would just at least hit somebody. Well, everybody scooted toward the center, and when they found out that their noise on the outside wasn't going to solve the problem, finally 5 men stepped into the church. 2 of them had machetes, 2 of them had shotguns, and 1 of them had a rope. They said, "Here's how this is going to go. We're going to give you 5 minutes to load your wife and your 4 daughters up and get out of here. If you don't, we are going to drag you over to this concrete altar. We're going to put your head down, and in front of your people, we're going to cut your head off." Miguel looked at them, and he began to laugh. He voluntarily walked over to the altar. He placed his head on the altar, and he said, "You can't take my head. I gave that up a long time ago. My life has been sacrificed already. So if this is what you're going to do, do it." They walked up with their machetes. They raised them over their heads. As they raised them over their heads, their arms stuck in the air. Their bodies began to shake. The machetes dropped to the ground. The shotguns dropped to the ground. And Mark Rutland began to ask the church people, he said, "Did this really happen here? Is this how this church was founded?" And the people were like, "Yes." He says, "This is incredible. I cannot believe that this could really have happened. How can this be?" And finally, the elders of the church stood up. And there were 5 of them. And they said, "This story's true. We were those 5 men, and we are now leading this church." You see, that's what it looks like for you and I to put our trust in God. You see, Miguel, he trusted the master plan of God. He had no qualms about it whatsoever. He was ready to obey God regardless of whatever results came. He could have gotten discouraged early on and just jetted out of the village and said, "Those people they can go to hell." But he kept going, and he kept preaching, and he kept roping his girls like cordwood to his little contraption that I'm sure would not have passed American safety standards. And Miguel knew that God's work would continue whether or not his head was still attached to his shoulders. And Miguel is not an exception to the rule. Miguel is an example to you and I of what it looks like to have our trust in God. And my question for you today is, where are you placing your trust? Where is your trust today? There's something more important in your life than the politics around you. It's the condition of your soul. I'm going to ask the music team if they'd return. We're going to prepare to close today. Where is your trust today? And maybe God is speaking to you right now. Maybe God is knocking on the door of your heart. And if He is, I want to encourage you to grab one of those Connect cards today. And on the back side, you'll see right up at the top, there's one box that says My Response. And it simply says, I know I need to respond to what I've heard today. If the Spirit of God is speaking to you, I'm going to ask you to check that box. And on your way out today, drop this into the Connect box because we're going to be praying for you today. Because we believe that God is at work. In spite of all of the nonsense that we see on TV and all of the kindling that we're getting in our mailboxes, with all of the ads that are political and all of this kind of stuff, regardless of the complete apparent ineptitude of both parties that are at work in our political system, there is a God in heaven who sits on a throne that if we will just dare to trust Him, let what happens to politics, fine, let it happen. We need to be as involved as God calls us to be. You should at least vote. I believe that. You should at least do that. Some of you have a calling of God on your life to get involved in the political process. And you should do that not for fame and fortune, but for the advancement of the kingdom of God. But ultimately, we cannot do the work of God if we are not trusting in God. Are you exercising the power that God has given you to simply trust Him? God's not going to force you to trust Him. You have a choice. You get to choose where you're going to place your trust. And this is what's different about this particular power, as I've been calling Him in this series. You get to choose where you're going to put your trust. You see, you're trusting somebody. You're trusting something. And if it's anything at the top of that trust list, if it's anything more than God, it's going to crumble down in a big old pile and in a big old heap. Only when your soul says, in God I trust, can you have peace in your heart. You see, when we trust God, it calms our anxieties, brings peace in the place of fear, builds your confidence in God, changes your perspective on things, brings joy to your heart that you didn't think you'd ever know. And what a God that allows us to be a part of what's going on. I mean, how does it set with you that in the eternal master plan of God, He chose the day and the hour and the minute and the second that you would be born, so that right now in the heart of central Montana, you could be right here hearing this. It's all part of God's master plan. And there's a reason for what God is doing in you, and a reason for what God wants to do through you.